Okay, believe it or not, this is my fifth attempt to record this lecture on the ontological argument by St. Anselm. And the first two didn't quite take. The third one took, but I wasn't really happy with the way it turned out. The fourth one, I got a message halfway, not halfway, maybe a little bit into the presentation that said my voice was too soft, too quiet, and they weren't able to do closed captioning. But I want closed captioning because I do. And so I thought, oh crap, let me shut that down then. But then when I went back, the closed captioning was working fine. So I'm hoping that this is going to turn out swell, and we'll find out soon enough, right? All right, so having said that, let me share my screen. And this is what I want to share. And then I want to do from the beginning. Okay, and if I did this right, you should be looking at a screen that says Evidential Arguments for Theism, and more specifically, the subtitle, The Ontological Argument. Now, in this portion of our module, we're looking at arguments for the existence of God, but specifically evidential arguments for the existence of God. In other words, these are arguments which are trying to prove that the proposition God exists is true. And the first of these arguments we're looking at is the ontological argument by St. Anselm. Now, I'll have a lot to say about that in a minute or two, but I'll do a little confession here. This was always my favorite evidential argument for the existence of God. I'm not saying that it necessarily works, but I always found it so clever, so intriguing, kind of captivating, and it remains so. And hopefully you'll be equally intrigued and captivated. So the ontological argument, or the name for the ontological argument, is coming from the Greek word on or ont, which is the present participle of the Greek word for being, right? Or to exist, to be, right? The verb to be. So being would be the act of existing. Thus, ontology would be the study of being, the study of the act of existing. And an ontology would be a general theory of being or existence, right? Sometimes the word ontology is used as a synonym for the branch of philosophy of metaphysics, right? The study of being, the study of existence, the study of reality. So I wish to make a passing comment. There are different ways to conceive of being, denoted as a static substance that undergoes no change, that which be, right? As a sort of, a static sort of existence. Or one can conceive of it as the act of being, like the act of swimming, right? So, but notice swimming as a participle is an adjective that modifies something, right? So you would say the swimming man, actually you're modifying the man who is swimming. And then the being of something would be the act of being. It denotes an act of existing, just as swimming denotes the act of swimming. This has ramifications if one's metaphysics as well as natural theology. We might say more about this later, but I might completely drop it and not mention it again. I'll make up my mind later on. I haven't made up my mind yet. Okay, so a gerund, pronounced gerund, is the verb of, or the acting as a noun. By that I mean that the verb, the word that describes the action that's happening, like biking or thinking or running or speaking. So I might say swimming is exhausting, or I might say biking is good exercise. And so I'm talking about the activity, but I'm describing the activity and I'm using the gerund in order to make to say things about that activity. But recall that I said the root of ontology was the ancient Greek participle, and a participle is an adjective, not a noun. Right? It's an adjective that modifies a noun. So if I talked about the sleeping cat, well, the cat is the thing, and sleeping is an activity that I'm attributing to the cat, but it's the cat that I'm attributing the activity to. On this interpretation, being would be conceived of as an adjective modifying something. So something is engaging in the act of being. But what would that thing be? Right? Well, anything existing is existing in the act of being. But I mention this because we'll see that some of the philosophers we're looking at in this section, in this module, do refer to being as an action, right? The act of being. In fact, Aquinas talks about God as actus purus, right? The pure act of being. But we're not looking at Aquinas today. Today we're looking at Saint Anselm. Saint Anselm was Bishop of Canterbury, and Anselm is taking as his reference the fool who hath said in his heart, there is no God. So his inspiration, Anselm's inspiration, is the Psalms, Psalm 53:1, right? Where it begins by saying, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Corrupt are they, and have done abominable iniquity. There is none that doeth good. So the psalmist wasn't a big fan of atheism, right? But notice Anselm is taking his inspiration from the Psalms, but he is not relying on faith for his justification, for his conclusion that God exists. He's only relying on natural reason. So he is squarely within the bounds of natural theology. Again, his inspiration is scriptural, but his argument is philosophical. Anselm attempts to show that only a fool would claim that God does not exist. Notice, it's not that the psalmist said that it's sinful to claim that God does not exist, or that it's wicked to claim that God does not exist, or it's incorrect to claim that God does not exist. No, the psalmist specifically said it's foolish to claim that God does not exist. And so this is what intrigues Anselm. What is foolish about atheism? He wished, Anselm this is, wished to demonstrate that if you really think carefully about the concept of God, you realize that God must exist. Understanding the nature of God, he believes, is enough to convince any clear-thinking person that God must exist. Because this argument is meant to show that being, ontos, is part of God's nature, that's why it's called the ontological argument. And you're saying that if one understands God's essence, his description, his concept, one would necessarily conclude that being, existence, is part of that essence or that nature. So the ontological argument is said to be an a priori argument. And this is a term that we need to get comfortable with. A priori means independent of experience. Now, if it helps to think prior to, a priori, that's fine as a way of remembering. But we mustn't think of a priori as prior to experience in the sense of, you were birthed with this understanding. Right? Prior to having any experience at all, you have this understanding. Some people did have this view of a priori, but that's not, I think, the most useful understanding of a priori. For our purposes, a priori simply means independent of experience, right? So it doesn't rely on experience in order to prove its point, right? Think of mathematics as an a priori science. 2 + 2 = 4. It's not because I've added up every two objects with another two objects, and every time I did, it came out to be 4. That would be based on experience. 2 cookies plus 2 cookies is 4 cookies. 2 kittens plus 2 kittens is 4 kittens. 2 pennies plus 2 pennies is 4 pennies. But I'm not done, right? Because there are infinitely many sets of 2 + 2s. No, I seem to know this a priori, independent of experience. For pairs of things I haven't even looked at yet, I know that 2 + 2 = 4. So that's the notion of a priori here. And what Anselm is suggesting then is God's essence is his existence, And so this is a logical or a priori in nature, right? It's independent of actual experience, logically prior to experience, not temporally prior to experience. So Anselm begins by examining the atheist contention, right? Again, the atheist says God does not exist. But what exactly does the atheist mean by God? We have to get clarity in our terms. Notice, if all the atheist is asserting is that Zeus does not exist, or Odin does not exist, or Isis does not exist, well, Anselm doesn't have a problem with that, because, of course, Anselm doesn't believe that Zeus exists, or Odin exists, or Isis exists either. So in that sense, the atheist and Anselm agree. Notice there's only a disagreement if the atheist is denying the God that Anselm asserts to exist. There's only a dispute between the atheist and Anselm if they have the same concept in mind. So, in order to clarify the discussion, Anselm proposes a definition of God. He says, well, here's what I mean by God. Anselm suggests that what I mean by God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, that's a sort of awkward phrase. I've made my peace with it years ago, but I've been teaching this a long time. But I remember at first, I found it a little bit cumbersome. But he's just basically having this in mind. He doesn't merely mean God is the greatest thing we can think of. Why? Well, because even the greatest thing we can think of might not be as great as God is. But God is no less than the greatest thing we can conceive of, right? He is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, whether we're up to the task of conceiving of God or not is a different question, but certainly he's at least as great as the greatest thing we can conceive of, and he might even be greater than that. So that's why Anselm chooses this phrase, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, have in mind, what is Anselm thinking about here? Well, ask yourself, the Greek god Zeus, is the Greek god Zeus that than which nothing greater can be conceived? Frankly, no, right? Zeus was powerful, but he wasn't all powerful. Zeus was knowledgeable, but he wasn't all knowing. And Zeus had his good days, but he wasn't all good. So we can conceive of something more powerful than Zeus, more knowledgeable than Zeus, better, more moral than Zeus. Thus, Zeus is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Quite the contrary. Zeus is that than which something greater can be conceived. A more powerful Zeus, a more moral Zeus, a more knowledgeable Zeus. You get the idea. So God means that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Anselm's definition of God does not pick out Zeus. In fact, Anselm's definition of God explicitly denies that Zeus is God. Right? He couldn't be, because he is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Maybe I'm beating a dead horse here. But with this as our definition, the atheist has two options. The atheist can either reject this definition and says, no, that's not what I mean by God. I don't mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Fine. But if the atheist chooses that option, that ends the conversation, because the atheist is simply not talking to Anselm. There's no dispute between them, because the atheist has some other concept of God in mind and not Anselm's concept. On the other hand, if you're going to be an atheist denying Anselm's concept of God, then you have to accept this definition. And so let's assume that's what the atheist does. The atheist says, yes, that's precisely what I mean by God. I'm saying that than which nothing greater can be conceived does not exist. So then, with our definitions in place, we can move on and sort of schematize Anselm's argument. So here's a diagram, right? On the left-hand side, we have the premises of his argument, and on the right-hand side, I'll indicate what the justifications are. So on the left-hand side, premise one, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. What justifies that premise? It's the definition. It's merely what Anselm means by God, and at this point, it's what Anselm and the atheist both mean by God. Roughly, this is something like the O God, which we discussed in a previous lecture. The God, the omni-God, omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, all good, all powerful, all loving. I missed one, all knowing. Omniscient is all knowing. Okay. But that than which nothing greater can be conceived, a God who possesses all of the perfections. Premise 2, it is greater to exist in the understanding and in reality than to exist in the understanding alone. Anselm offers this as a metaphysical principle. You think it's clear to common sense. It's conceptual truth, right? Which is greater, the $100 bill that exists in your understanding alone, or the $100 bill that exists in your understanding and in your back pocket? Right? I know which one I would rather have. And so this is what Anselm is trading on here. It is greater to exist in the reality and in the understanding than to merely exist in the understanding. And by exist in the understanding, he means it's conceptual. Right? Unicorns exist in our understanding. I know what a unicorn is. You know what a unicorn is. But they don't exist in reality. They don't. So they exist in the understanding alone. Then we have premise 3. That than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist in the understanding and in reality. Why is that? Well, that than which nothing greater can be conceived wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be conceived if it only existed in the understanding. If it only existed in the understanding, it would be that than which something greater can be conceived. You can conceive of that same thing existing both in the understanding and in reality. So anything which is going to live up to the definition of that than which nothing greater can be conceived would have to have both kinds of existence, existence in the understanding and existence in reality itself. Now we have our conclusion. God exists in the understanding and in reality. That simply follows from premise 1 and premise 3 by the substitution of co-referring terms, right? Since that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist in the understanding and in reality, that's premise 3, and since God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, that's premise 1, we get premise 4, or the conclusion actually, that God exists in the understanding and in reality. So here's a graphic for a worlds ahead graphic, no doubt, for what's going on here. We have two rival concepts of God, the God which exists in the mind and in reality, and the God which exists in the mind alone. But what Anselm is pointing out is the atheist is suggesting that God exists in the mind alone. I understand what it is. I just deny that it exists in reality. Whereas Anselm is suggesting that the God exists in his understanding and in reality. But these are not equivalent concepts, Anselm points out. He's saying, my concept of God is greater than what the atheist is alleging. So these are not equal. So the God on the right-hand side is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Why is it? Well, look to the left, right? So is the atheist concept of God that than which nothing greater can be conceived? No, right? Why? Because we can think of at least one thing which is greater. No, maybe there's something even greater than what Anselm has in mind, but it's certainly that than which nothing greater can be conceived does not describe what the atheist has in mind. According to Anselm, the atheist is left claiming that God, who does exist in the understanding and reality, does not exist in reality. Or that than which nothing greater can be conceived is something than which something greater can be conceived. But we see why that's foolish. This is foolish. The only person who would say something like that is someone who literally doesn't know what he's talking about. It's as if I claim that I can conceive of a triangle with 4 sides. Whatever I might be thinking of, either it's not a triangle or it doesn't have 4 sides, but it's impossible that it be both. There's no way I could be thinking both of a 4-sided thing and a triangle at the same time, and I must be a fool for thinking otherwise. Likewise, according to Anselm, whatever the atheist is thinking about, either it does exist or it's not God. But there's no way to truly conceive of God as not existing. Again, Anselm's proof is meant to be an a priori proof of the existence of God. It's not grounded in experience, it's grounded in mere logic and conceptual analysis. What an ontological argument claims is that if we just think about what we mean by God, then it becomes clear to us that God must exist. Again, that existence is part of his essence or his nature. Here's another way of schematizing the argument. We can say something like this. God is a being with all perfections. That's just the definition of God. Existence is a perfection. Obviously true that a thing with existence is greater than a thing which lacks it. Therefore, God is a being with existence. That seems to be a deductively valid argument, right? God is a being with all perfections. Existence is a perfection. God is a being with existence. Again, and maybe I'm overstressing this, but I'll do it. Why not? The definition is such as that it will always point to the greater conception of God. It may move on to an even greater conception of God, but it's always looking for the greater concept. And so of two rival concepts of the existence of God, let's say God A and God B, the definition will always pick the greater of the two. So, as mentioned earlier, if we compare the O God, all good, all powerful, all loving, all knowing, keep missing that one, versus Zeus, not all good, not all knowing, not all powerful, well, then the definition is going to reject Zeus in favor of the O God. Why? Well, because Zeus is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But what Anselm is saying, the same thing is going on here with the atheist conception of God and Anselm's conception of God. On the left-hand side, we have the O God, which exists in the understanding and in reality. And on the right-hand side, we have the O God, which exists in the understanding alone. Well, these are not equivalent, right? And so just as the definition would reject Zeus in favor of the God on the left-hand side, likewise, the definition is rejecting the atheist conception in favor of the definition on the left-hand side. That than which nothing greater can be conceived is not described by the right-hand side. Okay, so hopefully you're intrigued. I certainly was by this point. What's going on here? I remember reading somewhere where David Hume, the 18th century philosopher, scholar, librarian, said of the ontological argument, it confounds but does not convince, which is what's going on here. I've actually tried to find out where that quote comes from. I've not found it. And so perhaps he never said it, and perhaps I misunderstood what I was reading or something like that. But there is something which is arresting about the ontological argument, at least thus far. Or that was my initial take. But it immediately drew criticisms, right? Even in Anselm's own day. So the first of the individuals we're going to look at criticizing this was Gaunilo, who was a monk, a contemporary of Anselm, but he argued that Anselm's argument is not good. To critique Anselm's argument, he offered an argument of his own, which he thought followed the same format, but yielded an absurd conclusion. He begins by defining what he calls the most perfect island. And he says the most perfect island is the island which has all perfections. Definition of what he means by the most perfect island. Premise 2, existence is a perfection, as with Anselm. Therefore, the most perfect island must exist. Oh, well then, let's go find it, right? Let's go in a boat and go around the world until we find this perfect island, which we can be certain exists. But Gaunilo says this is absurd. One cannot prove the existence of anything, a perfect island or God for that matter, priori. The only way we're going to know if such an island exists is to go and experience the world. You got to go find it. There's a sense in which Gaunilo was an empiricist. He thought that our knowledge of the world is based on our experience of the world, and we can't know whether a most perfect island exists a priori, nor can we know whether God exists a priori. So, again, this would be silly to think we're going to jump in a boat and go find this most perfect island, which we prove a priori. Again, he thinks this is ridiculous. But if this is ridiculous, then so is Aquinas. So is Anselm's argument. Several centuries later, St. Thomas Aquinas likewise criticizes this argument. Aquinas, too, was an empiricist who thought that knowledge has to be grounded in experience, and when one cannot know the existence of anything a priori. So, along with Gaunilo, Aquinas asserts that one cannot prove the existence of God a priori, and Anselm's argument fails. David Hume, yet again an empiricist, does not address the argument directly, but he can be seen to have said much the same thing indirectly in his work called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Quoting from that work, Hume, one of the people participating in this dialogue, he has several fictional characters talking to each other. And one of the characters says the following: I shall begin by observing that there is an evident absurdity in pretending to demonstrate a matter of fact, or to prove it by any arguments a priori. Nothing is demonstrable a priori unless the contrary implies a contradiction. Nothing that is distinctly conceivable implies a contradiction. Whatever we can conceive to as exist, we can conceive of as non-existent. There is no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. Consequently, there is no being whose existence is demonstrable a priori. I propose this argument as entirely decisive, and I am willing to rest the whole of the controversy upon it. So what does he have in mind? Look, I can prove that there exists no married bachelor. Why? Because the very concept of a married bachelor implies a logical contradiction. Something can't both be a bachelor and married at the same time. So since a married bachelor implies a contradiction, the non-existence of a married bachelor can be demonstrated a priori. But does the non-existence of, does the existence, try that one more time. Does denying the existence of any existing thing imply a contradiction? Hume says no. I can imagine the Eiffel Tower existing, and I could imagine the Eiffel Tower as not existing. I could imagine a bowling ball existing, or I can imagine a bowling ball not existing, and that goes for any object of existence. So I can imagine God as existing, I can imagine God as non-existing, and it doesn't imply a contradiction any more than a non-existing Eiffel Tower or a non-existing bowling ball implies a contradiction. Well, if that's true, if anything I can conceive of as existing, I could equally well conceive of as not existing, then I can't prove the existence of anything a priori. That's the line of his argument. In other words, to prove X a priori requires that not X entails some sort of contradiction. The non-existence of anything, including God, can be conceived clearly. Anything that can be conceived clearly entails no logical contradiction. The non-existence of God entails no contradiction. One cannot prove the existence of God a priori, Hume concludes. But notice Hume just seems to be claiming that anything, including God, can be conceived of as non-existing. In short, he's just claiming that Anselm is wrong, and that God can be conceived of as not existing without contradiction. But he doesn't really address Anselm's argument. What precisely is wrong with that? So of the critics that we've looked at so far, Gaunilo, Aquinas, and Hume, They're basically telling Anselm, well, you can't do that. You can't prove the existence of God a priori. Why not? Well, I can conceive of God as not existing, he claims. Can you? Because Anselm just gave us an argument to say, no, you can't. Whatever you're conceiving of, either it's not God or it does exist. Well, I can conceive of a four-sided triangle. I'm thinking of it right now. But no, you're not. We know a priori that there's no such thing as a four-sided triangle. So just asserting that you can conceive of God as non-existing doesn't demonstrate you've conceived of God as non-existing, particularly when there's an argument to be dealt with and you haven't dealt with the argument. Remember, when we were talking about argument analysis, and philosophy, we said, look, if I give you a valid syllogism, such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, and you claim that the conclusion is false, or at least unwarranted, you have to tell me which of the premises is false and why. Anselm gives us an argument. Nobody's yet told what the troublesome premise is and why it's false or unwarranted. So I don't know that any of these formidable philosophers have defeated the ontological argument thus far. While these criticisms are directed at the argument, none precisely say what's wrong with the argument. But Hume actually comes quite close to Immanuel Kant's critique in another work he wrote, not Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, but another work, where he says to reflect on anything simply and to reflect on it as existent are nothing different from each other. That idea, existence, when conjoined to the idea of any other object, makes no addition to it. And this is from his treatise on human nature, again, a different work of Hume's. So this anticipates what I think Kant will point out as the real problem with Anselm's ontological argument. Again, what Hume is suggesting is when I think of a unicorn, and then when I think of a unicorn as existing, I haven't actually added to my concept. I've added nothing to it. To conceive of it at all is to conceive of it as existing. Whether it exists or not is another story, but it makes no addition to the object. So I said that. Immanuel Kant puts his finger on what I think is the real troublesome premise, and that is premise 2. Kant claims that existence is not a great making property. It's not a perfection, because it's not a property at all. It doesn't describe a thing. To say that a thing exists does not further describe or modify the thing. Imagine I told you all these qualities about Bessie the cow. I said, oh, Bessie is a cow, and she's black and white, and she likes clover, and she comes in at sunset. She comes into the barn at sunset. And I'm giving you all of these descriptions of Bessie. And your mental image of Bessie is getting more defined, more defined, more defined, more defined with each and every descriptive predicate I offer about Bessie. Oh, she's 500 pounds. I don't know how heavy cows are, but maybe something like that. And then I said, oh, and another thing, Bessie exists. Well, has your mental picture of Bessie changed in the least? No, it merely means that photograph, that mental photograph you have of Bessie relates to something in the world someplace. And maybe if you walk around New Jersey long enough, you're going to find something that matches that mental photograph that I've described for you. So to say that Bessie exists is not to further modify Bessie. It's not to give you a descriptive predicate of Bessie. It's to say that that description is satisfied by some object in the world. To say that Bessie does not exist doesn't change the description. It's merely saying the very same description is not satisfied by anything existing in the world. If that's true, and this is Kant's criticism, then existence is not a descriptive predicate. Existence is not a property of a thing. Existence is not a great making property of a thing because it's not a property at all. Thus, it's not a perfection. So here we have the problem with Anselm's argument. Anselm's argument turned upon premise 2, existence is a perfection. If Kant is right about this, existence is not a perfection. It's not a great-making property because it's not a property at all. Imagine that the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education here at FIU authorized our philosophy department to hire a new philosophy professor. Yay! Now, that doesn't happen very often. So we want to make sure that we have a job description which will identify the most qualified candidates. And so we want to make sure that we don't miss anything important when we publish our job description. Whom are we looking for when we hire this new philosopher to join our department? And so we're so scrupulous that we create two different committees, two different search committees, and both are charged with coming up with a job description, Committee A and Committee B, because we want to make sure we didn't overlook something. So we have these two independent committees that are coming up with a job description for to talk about what qualities we're looking for in our next hire. So Committee A comes up with the following list. They say, Committee A, we want someone who's a good teacher. We want someone knowledgeable about philosophy, and we want someone who's enthusiastic. Right? So those are the qualities Committee A says we're looking for in our next hire. And Committee B says, oh my goodness, that's the list you came up with? You're going to be so surprised because you know what? You said good teacher, and that got on our list, good teacher. You said knowledgeable about philosophy, that was on our list, knowledgeable about philosophy. You said enthusiastic, good heavens, surprise, surprise, we came up with enthusiastic as well. But Committee B says, wait a minute, though, you missed something very important, and you didn't put it on your list. We need to add it to the list. We want someone who exists. Well, this is a little silly, right? To add existence to the list of qualities we're looking for in our next hire. Because look again, or imagine, call before your mind's eye, list A and list B. Anything that satisfies list A would satisfy list B, and anything which satisfies list B would satisfy list A. That means the addition of existence to the column doesn't actually add a descriptive predicate. Again, they describe all and only the same things. Again, what Hume had pointed out, that idea, existence, when conjoined with the idea of any object, makes no addition to it. That's why adding existence to the bottom of the list doesn't actually change the description in the slightest. It's not a descriptive predicate. But consider this. List A, good teacher, knowledgeable about philosophy, enthusiastic. And list B, good teacher, knowledgeable about philosophy, and enthusiastic and bilingual. Well, that makes a difference, doesn't it? Because there are things which would satisfy list A that would not satisfy list B. That makes a descriptive difference then. They're not describing all and only the same things. List B is only describing a subset of what list A describes, but not in all and only the members of the set of list A. Now list A and list B do not pick out all and only the same things, and that's because bilingual is a real descriptive property. It makes a difference to the two lists in a way that existence does not. According to Kant, here's the real dispute going on between Anselm and the atheist. It is not that they're operating with two different conceptions of God, Anselm having the superior conception. No, here's what's going on. Anselm is saying this concept, this description, is satisfied by some existing thing, and the atheist is saying that this description is not satisfied by any existing thing. And so if you're wondering what's the little beach ball at the bottom, so I'm saying that Anselm is saying my description picks out some object in reality, the world, that does in fact exist, And the atheist is saying, the very same concept that you have, Anselm, I'm denying that. I'm saying it picks out no object in the world, no object in reality. But if this is true, then they're not operating with different concepts. They're operating with precisely the same concepts. The difference isn't the concept of God that they're working with. The difference is that Anselm believes that concept is satisfied by some existing object, and the atheist is denying that that concept is satisfied by any existing object. So we're done here. Is that it? Is that the end of Anselm's ontological argument? No. And why is that? It's not quite the end of the argument. Why? Well, Anselm gives a second formulation. Now, it's not clear that even Anselm realized he had given a second formulation. But when Anselm was responding to Gaunilo, Anselm claimed that his argument, his ontological argument, can only be applied to God and does not apply to islands or anything else, right? So remember, Gaunilo says the most perfect island would be an island with all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore the most perfect island must exist. And Gaunilo goes on to suggest that's silly nonsense, right? But Anselm says, no, this doesn't work for islands, it only works for God. Well, isn't that convenient? He goes, no, there's a reason why it only works for God, right? And that's because even the most perfect island would be a contingent, dependent thing. Contingent is a concept we looked at in a previous lecture. Anselm's argument, his second formulation of the ontological argument, again, this is one he offers in response to Gaunilo, depends on a distinction between necessary existence and contingent existence. To say that a thing has contingent existence is to say that it's limited or dependent. It's limited in space or in time, or it owes its existence to other things or other causes. So what Anselm is saying is even the most perfect island would be a contingent object. It would be limited in space, it would be limited in time, and it would be dependent on other things. Weather patterns going the way they're supposed to, or I don't know, geological evolution going the way it was supposed to. We might not be living at the right time. We might not be living in the right place as coexisting with the most perfect island. Maybe things just didn't go the right way to bring about the most perfect island. Again, even the most perfect island would be contingent. It would owe its existence to other features, other causes, other things. Again, it would be limited in space and limited in time, contained or contingent. Now, what's the opposite of contingent existence? Never mind whether any such thing exists yet. Just ask, what's the opposite? Well, the opposite of contingent would be not contingent, right? Unlimited by space, unlimited by time, unlimited by causal constraints. Necessary existence would be unlimited or unconditioned existence. A thing has necessary existence if its existence rather depends on no other thing and no other causes. At this point, we merely need to understand what Anselm's conceptual distinction is here. Whether anything exists, let's try that again, whether anything with necessary existence or not is a separate question. So whether there is anything with necessary existence or not is a different question. Just what does that mean? Can we conceive of something which exists on its own and depends for nothing else for its own existence? If we can conceive of such an object, one with necessary existence, then we might agree that such an object is possible, even though perhaps not actual. Say, well, okay, I suppose it's possible that a necessary object exists. The question just arises, do we have reason to think that a necessary object exists? But now the question becomes, which is greater? To exist with contingent existence or to exist with necessary existence? Anselm claims that God, by definition, would not only have to exist, but would rather it must have necessary existence. In order for that than which nothing greater can be conceived to be that than which nothing greater can be conceived, it must have independent, unlimited existence. So here's formulation number 2. Now it's different than formulation number 1. Formulation number 1 is trading on the notion of ordinary garden variety existence. But here's formulation number 2. God is a being with all perfections, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, definition of God. Necessary existence is a perfection. Obviously true that a thing with necessary existence is greater than a thing with contingent existence. Therefore, God has necessary existence. We're back to a valid syllogism. If God is a being with all perfections, and if necessary existence is a perfection, then by definition, God is a being with necessary existence. So notice, let's go back to our philosophy department hiring descriptions, right? List A, we want a good teacher, knowledgeable about philosophy, and enthusiastic. List B, we want a good teacher, knowledgeable about philosophy, enthusiastic with necessary existence. Well, now notice list A and list B do not pick out all and only the same things. List A picks out certain things that list B does not pick out. So list A picks out a larger set of objects than list B. List B would only pick out a subset of list A. My point, necessary existence makes a difference. Adding it to the list of descriptive properties makes a difference in the way that adding bilingual to the list of descriptive properties makes a difference. So back to my worlds ahead graphic, we have two rival conceptions of God. God as being existing necessarily, and God as existing not necessarily. If Anselm's right here, the God on the left picks out a greater concept than the God on the right. So the God on the right couldn't possibly be that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Why? Because we can conceive of something greater. Scan to the left. Again, A and B do not pick out all and only the same things because necessary existence is a real descriptive property. It makes a difference to the two lists in the way that ordinary garden variety existence does not. So where does this leave us? Well, perhaps only with a conditional. One might be willing to admit this. If God exists, then he would have necessary existence, but it remains to be seen whether God exists. Notice this is how it works with all the other perfections ascribed to God by definition. What you're saying is, if God exists, then he would be all-knowing, or if God exists, then he would be all-powerful, or if God exists, then he would be all-good. But it remains to be seen whether God exists or not. Well, on this understanding, you're making the same kind of hypothetical statement. If God exists, then he would have necessary existence, but it remains to be seen whether God exists or not. On that interpretation, even the second formulation of God, try that again. On that interpretation, even the second formulation of Anselm's argument does not succeed in proving the actual existence of God. It merely proves the hypothetical. Still, there seems something fishy about saying if the necessary being exists. After all, what might have happened which would have prevented the necessary being exist? Maybe his parents decided not to have kids after all? Wouldn't matter, he's a necessary being. Well, maybe evolution didn't turn out the right way? Doesn't matter, he's a necessary being. Well, maybe the Big Bang universal constants weren't calibrated correctly? Doesn't matter, he's a necessary being. By definition, nothing could prevent the necessary being from existing. And so why say if the necessary being exists, when we know by definition nothing could have prevented the necessary being from existing? It's perhaps worth mentioning that Anselm would have been quite pleased that his ontological argument capitalizes on classical theism with its roots in Platonic metaphysics. Specifically, that there's an interconvertibility between being, goodness, truth, and beauty, what the Neoplatonists call the transcendentals. And Anselm had strong Platonist sympathies. In fact, I think his argument is motivated by his Platonist sympathies. But equally congruent with the concept of God, it is rather equally congruent with the concept of God in Hebrew scriptures, which identifies God with being itself. In the book of Exodus, God tells Moses to go to the Israelites and let him know that he wants to talk with them or deal with them or whatever, right? And Moses says to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to him? And God says to Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Elohi, I'm not sure, am I saying that right? I am has sent me to you. Now, the Tetragrammaton, if I'm saying that right, is the four-letter name of God given here in Exodus, often transliterated in English as YHWH. However, all the letters are consonants, because in Hebrew, all letters are consonants. Vowel sounds are typically not letters in Hebrew and never appear. Thus, the word represented by YHWH can, in normal Hebrew, be rendered in more than one way, but is rooted in the concept of being, existing, I am. Depending on how it is pronounced, that is, which vowels one uses, one might legitimately interpret that four letters as I am, or I was, or even I will be. Right? I be, I exist, I am, I was, I will be. Grammatically, YHWH indicates a singular act, not one that is completed or over with. Being the gerund, right? Being existing, right? The root meaning to exist, being, or the verb to be. Consider I am swimming. Yeah, still? And for how long? Well, I be swimming. I exist swimming. Perhaps the most prominent modern advocate of the ontological argument, and there are modern defenders, and one of which is Alvin Plantinga, one of the foremost philosophers of religion of the 20th and now the 21st century. He's getting on there in years. I'm not sure if he's publishing as much these days. Right? But Plantinga is best known for his philosophical apologetics for theism and his contention that theistic belief is foundational, that religious belief does not stand in need of external justification. But he's also known for his work in modal logic, that is, logic which examines questions of logical necessity and contingency. Plantinga applies this approach to modal logic to the ontological argument. So his work in modal logic he applies to the ontological argument and presents the argument using these modal logical terms. He contends that given certain widely accepted systems of formal modal logic, one can create a formally valid version of Anselm's ontological argument. It's something like this. It is possible that the proposition, the O God exists, is necessarily true. Now, in these systems of modal logic, to say that something is necessarily true is to say that it's true in all possible worlds. That's how you cash it out, right? So to say that it's possible that it's necessarily true is to say that there exists some possible world in which the claim God exists is necessarily true. That's premise 2. So granting that it's possible that it's necessarily true means there's some possible world in which it is necessarily true. Therefore, there is some possible world in which the proposition, it is true in all possible worlds that God exists, is true. Right? In that possible world where it's necessarily true. Why? Because that's what it means to say it's necessarily true. It's that it's true in all possible worlds. So in that possible world, it's true that in all possible worlds, it's true. But then we get number 4. Therefore, it is true in all possible worlds that the proposition, the "O God exists," is true. But then it follows from number 5. Well, it doesn't follow. It's a matter of fact, our world, the actual world, is a possible world. Therefore, it is true in our world that the proposition God exists is true. Therefore, it is true that the "O God exists." So this is a sort of summary of Plantinga's reformulation in contemporary terms. However, this defense requires, number 1, buying into modal logic in general and this possible worlds discourse as a way of explicating these modal terms, necessity, contingency. Some philosophers resist that. Number 2, accepting as a theorem of the system of modal logic that if something, if it's possible that some proposition P is necessarily true, then it is true that some proposition is necessarily true. Again, true in all possible worlds. That has to be a theorem of your system of modal logic, and there are those who reject that as a theorem. But then perhaps the most vulnerable presumption of the argument is to claim that we have positive knowledge that a necessary being, that is God, is in fact possible. How do we know that it's possible? That's premise 1. It is possible that the "O God exists necessarily" is true. How do we know that that's the case? Maybe the "O God" does entail some sort of logical impossibility. Plantinga's defense has been criticized on all 3 of these grounds. I mention this because it kind of rounds things out. It just shows that this is an ongoing debate. It's not just something that happened hundreds of years ago. It's continuing on today. And so that actually kind of concludes my remarks for today. So I'm going to stop my share, and I hope this has been interesting and intriguing. And that concludes our remarks on the ontological argument for the time being. Naturally, if you have any questions, I'd be only too happy to discuss them with you. Until next time.